People disappear in the mountains every year, but sometimes cases defy explanation. A man who returned after 2 years, convinced that only 4 days had passed, a tourist who disappeared in a minute on an open trail, and a teacher who vanished from a crowded observation deck, only to be found years later in a completely different place. These stories are not about accidents. They are about mysteries that neither investigators nor scientists have been able to solve. If you are interested in such mystical disappearances, subscribe so you don't miss new investigations. Now, let's take a look at 3 of the most inexplicable cases that will give you goosebumps. On 14th of August 1989, 33-year-old Thomas Gordon, a surveyor from Salt Lake City, set out on a solo hike in the Wind River Range in Bridger-Teton National Forest, Wyoming. Thomas was an experienced hiker with 10 years of experience hiking in the Rocky Mountains. He carefully planned each expedition, studied topographic maps, checked the weather forecast, and always left a detailed itinerary at the ranger station. On that August day, the weather was perfect for hiking. The temperature was around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, the sky was clear, and there was a light breeze. Thomas registered at the ranger station in the morning and left his exact route. He planned to climb to about 10,000 feet through a series of alpine meadows and granite fields, then return in 3 days. The ranger recorded the information and wished him luck. Everything was standard. Thomas loaded his backpack with the necessary equipment: a tent, a sleeping bag, 5 days' worth of food, a camping stove, maps, a compass, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. On his wrist was a reliable mechanical watch, a simple model without electronics that he had worn for years. He set off on his route around 9 in the morning. 3 days passed. On 17th August, when Thomas did not return by the appointed time, the rangers began to worry. By evening, a preliminary check was organized. Perhaps he had simply delayed for a day, deciding to explore an additional area. By noon on 18th August, when Thomas still hadn't shown up, a full-scale search operation began. 2 search dogs with handlers were brought in on 19th August. The dogs were given Thomas's clothes from his car, parked at the trailhead, to sniff. Both dogs picked up the scent and confidently led the team along the route Thomas had indicated. The trail led through the forest, up the slope, across alpine meadows dotted with wildflowers. At an altitude of about 10,400 feet, where the forest ended and a vast granite field began, an area of bare rock several acres in size, the dogs stopped. They sniffed the edge of the granite field, circled around, and tried to pick up the trail again. But the trail disappeared on the rock. All attempts to direct the dogs around the granite field to find the trail on the other side were unsuccessful. The search operation was expanded. By the end of the week, 50 rangers and volunteers were working on site, combing the area within a 10-mile radius of the granite field. Helicopters flew over the mountains, checking remote canyons and hard-to-reach areas. Climbers surveyed steep slopes and crevasses. Every square foot was thoroughly checked. 2 weeks of intensive searching yielded no results. No clothes, no equipment, no traces of Thomas. It was as if he had vanished into thin air on that granite field. By the end of August, the official search operation was called off. The case remained open, but there were no leads. Thomas's wife, parents, and friends did not give up hope. They organized private searches every weekend for the next few months. They checked remote areas and hired professional searchers. A reward of $20,000 was offered for information, but months turned into a year, and hope slowly faded. A year later, in August 1990, Thomas Gordon was officially declared dead. The family held a memorial service, even though there was no body. Life went on, but questions remained. On 22 September 1991, exactly 2 years and 39 days after Thomas's disappearance, a group of 4 hikers was trekking through a remote section of forest about 47 miles north of where Thomas had disappeared, near the Montana border. It was a remote area where people rarely ventured. Around noon, the hikers noticed a man strolling toward them on the trail. He moved slowly and unsteadily, as if disoriented. As he got closer, it became clear that the man was in poor condition, emaciated with a long beard and wearing dirty and torn clothes. The tourist called out to him. The man stopped and looked at them with a hazy gaze. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" one of the tourists asked. The man nodded, but did not seem to understand where he was. The tourists gave him water and food. He drank greedily, like a man who had not drunk for a long time. "What's your name? What happened to you?" the tourist asked. Thomas Gordon," he croaked. One of the tourists remembered that name. 2 years ago, there were news reports about an engineer from Salt Lake City who disappeared in the Wind River Range. Could it be him? Thomas was taken by helicopter to the nearest hospital. The doctors conducted a preliminary examination. He was severely dehydrated, emaciated, and weighed about 30 pounds less than his normal weight. However, there were no serious injuries, no fractures, deep cuts, or signs of animal attacks. Just extreme exhaustion and dehydration. Thomas's family was notified immediately. His wife flew to Wyoming that same night. When she entered the room and saw her husband, alive, though emaciated, she couldn't believe her eyes. Tears, hugs, and questions with no answers. When Thomas regained enough consciousness to speak coherently, he insisted on something impossible. "I don't understand what's going on. Why are you all talking about 2 years? It's only been 4 days since I started my hike." 4 days, not 2 years. His wife explained that today was 22nd of September 1991. He had disappeared on 14th of August 1989. 2 years and 39 days had passed. Thomas looked at her with incomprehension and fear. "That's impossible. I remember starting the hike on Monday morning. I was climbing up to the granite field. Was that yesterday? The day before yesterday? Not 2 years ago." The doctors conducted a thorough medical examination. The results were shocking. Biologically, Thomas's body showed signs of starvation for about 5 to 6 days, no more. Weight loss, dehydration, muscle wasting. Everything was consistent with a person who had spent about a week without sufficient food and water. But not 2 years. His beard had grown for about a month, maybe a little more. Not 2 years. His hair was longer, but again it had grown for about a month, not 2 years. His fingernails and toenails also showed about a month's growth. Thomas's clothes were worn, torn, and dirty, but not as much as one would expect after 2 years in the wild. His hiking boots were in surprisingly good condition. The soles were moderately worn, the seams intact. Boots worn for 2 years in mountainous terrain would have looked entirely different. The strangest detail was the watch on his wrist. The mechanical watch that Thomas had worn for years had stopped. The hands were frozen at 12:47. The date on the dial was 14th August 1989, the day he disappeared. The investigation team questioned Thomas repeatedly. His story remained unchanged. He remembered starting his hike on the morning of 14th August. He remembered climbing the trail, enjoying the views. Around noon, he reached a granite field at an altitude of about 10,400 feet. "I stopped to rest and drink some water," Thomas said. "I sat on a large flat rock and surveyed the area. Everything was normal. Then I felt a strange dizziness. It wasn't like altitude sickness. I'm used to high altitudes. It was something else. The air seemed to vibrate. I heard a low hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time." Thomas continued, "I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't obey me. The dizziness got worse. Everything around me began to blur, as if I were looking through water. Then darkness. I lost consciousness. The next thing I remember is waking up on some kind of trail. It was morning. The sun was just rising. I was lying on the ground. My backpack was next to me. My head hurt. My mouth was dry. I thought I had fallen and hit my head, losing consciousness for the night. I got up and looked around. The area looked unfamiliar. I didn't recognize the place. I started walking along the trail, hoping to come across some familiar landmarks. I walked for a day, 2, 3. I ran out of food. I ran out of water. I began to realize that I was seriously lost. Then I met those tourists. I thought 4, maybe 5 days had passed, not 2 years. Psychologists conducted a series of tests: lie detector, cognitive assessments, checks for mental disorders. The results were precise. Thomas was not lying. He sincerely believed what he was saying. There were no signs of deception, schizophrenia, or dissociative disorders. His memory of events before his disappearance was clear, detailed, and consistent. Amnesia experts were consulted. Perhaps Thomas had suffered a severe head injury that caused retrograde amnesia, a loss of memory of events that occurred after a certain point in time. He could have survived 2 years in the wild, then suffered an injury, erased his memory, and created a false memory that only a few days had passed. But this theory did not explain the biological data. Thomas's body showed no signs of survival for 2 years in the wild. It did not explain the stopped watches. It did not explain the condition of his clothes and shoes. Another version was that Thomas had been somewhere in civilization all this time, possibly suffering from amnesia, then returned to the mountains shortly before he was found. Investigators checked this version. Thomas's bank accounts showed no activity for 2 years. His credit cards had not been used. No one saw him in any city, at any gas station, or in any store. If he was somewhere in civilization for 2 years, how did he survive without money or documents? Physicists and meteorologists were consulted about the air vibrations and rumbling that Thomas described. Could it have been some kind of natural phenomenon? An earthquake? An atmospheric anomaly? Seismic station records for 14th August 1989 showed no activity in the Wind River Range region. Meteorological data was also normal. No abnormal phenomena were recorded. The rangers returned to the granite field where the search dogs had lost Thomas's trail 2 years earlier. They conducted a detailed survey of the area. They checked their compasses. Perhaps a magnetic anomaly had caused disorientation. The compasses were working normally. No anomalies were found. Thomas Gordon's story became a media sensation. Journalists from all over the country came to interview him. Headlines screamed about time portals, paranormal phenomena, and the Wyoming mystery. Thomas avoided most interviews. He wanted to return to everyday life, but it was impossible. A few months later, when the hype had died down a bit, Thomas returned to Salt Lake City. He tried to rebuild his life, but everything had changed in 2 years. His job had been given to someone else. His friends thought he was dead. Then he suddenly returned, but he didn't remember the last 2 years. Some looked at him with suspicion, others with curiosity, and still others with fear. Thomas and his wife eventually divorced. She loved him, but she couldn't cope with the strangeness of the situation, with the constant questions, with the fact that her husband had lost 2 years of his life and couldn't explain how. The case was officially closed as unexplained. The investigation team wrote in their report, Thomas Gordon was found alive on September 22, 1991, 2 years and 39 days after his disappearance. Medical and physical evidence does not correspond to the period of his absence. There is no explanation. The case is closed without resolution. Thomas spent the rest of his life trying to understand what had happened to him. He kept a diary, recording every detail of his memories of that day on the granite field. He tried to find a scientific explanation. He read books on physics, quantum mechanics, and relativity. Maybe somewhere in those equations was the answer. Years later, in an interview with a small scientific journal, Thomas said, "I don't know what happened on that granite field. I don't know where I was for 2 years. All I know is that 4 days passed for me. No more. My body, my watch, my memory, everything says 4 days. But the calendar says 2 years. Where is the truth? I spent 20 years trying to find the answer. There is none. Thomas Gordon died in 2011 of natural causes. The story of his lost 2 years remains one of the most mysterious and inexplicable in the annals of disappearances in national parks. Scientists who studied the case found no rational explanation. Skeptics claimed that Thomas was lying or suffering from mental illness, although all tests showed the opposite. Believers spoke of a miracle or supernatural intervention. The granite field, at an altitude of 10,400 feet in the Wind River Range, remains an ordinary place. Tourists pass through there regularly. No one else has reported strange vibrations or humming. No one else has disappeared in such an inexplicable way. But some tourists who know the story give the place a wide berth, preferring not to take any chances. What happened to Thomas Gordon on 14th August 1989 at 12:47 p.m.? Where was he for 2 years? Or was it 4 days as he claimed? Nature provides no answers. Some mysteries may not be revealed. There are places in the endless mountains of Wyoming where time flows differently, or where time does not exist at all. We will never know for sure. On 3rd of October 1993, 26-year-old Sarah Hollis and her friend Brian Marks set out on a day hike up Old Rag Mountain in Shenandoah National Park, Virginia. It is one of the most popular trails in the park, a scenic route with technical rock climbing sections that lead to a summit at about 3,200 feet. The weather was perfect for hiking: clear October skies, a temperature of about 60 degrees, and a light breeze. Sarah worked as a graphic designer in Washington, D.C. Brian was a programmer at the same company. They had been friends for several years and regularly went hiking on weekends. Both were in good physical shape and had experience hiking in the mountains. They were familiar with Old Rag Mountain, having climbed it twice in the past year. On the morning of 3rd in October, they arrived at the trailhead around 9 a.m. They signed the visitor log, leaving information about their route and planned return time. They loaded their backpacks with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and maps. Sarah took her camera. She loved to photograph landscapes. The climb took about 3 hours. The route was moderately complex. Through the forest, then across open rocky areas where they had to climb using their hands. For experienced hikers, it was a pleasant adventure. Not extreme, but interesting enough. Around noon, they reached the summit. The view was breathtaking. The Shenandoah Valley stretched out below, covered in the autumn colors of the forest. Sarah took several photos. They sat at the top for about 20 minutes, enjoying the views, snacking, and resting. Around 12:30, they began their descent. The route down followed the same trail. On narrow sections, it is customary to walk single file. Brian, as the more experienced climber, led the way with Sarah following about 65 feet behind. The standard safe distance. They periodically called out to each other to check that everything was okay. At about 1:15 p.m., 45 minutes after beginning their descent, they passed through an open section of the trail. It was a rocky ridge overlooking the valley. The trail here was relatively wide, about 3 feet, with no technical difficulties. It was just a rocky path running along the slope. Brian stopped at a rocky outcrop to admire the view. He stood with his back to the trail, looking down at the valley below. Sarah should have been about 65 feet behind him. Brian later swore that he had stood there for no more than 40 or 45 seconds, a minute at most. When he turned around, intending to call out to Sarah and show her the breathtaking view, she was gone. The trail behind him was empty. Brian thought Sarah had fallen behind a little more than he thought. He walked back down the trail a few dozen feet, calling out, "Sarah, where are you?" Silence. Only the wind in the trees and the distant cry of a bird. Brian began to worry. He walked further back along the trail to where they had come from. The area was open. He could see the trail for several hundred feet in both directions. No one. Sarah couldn't have gotten far in a minute, even if she had run. which would have been strange and dangerous on a mountain trail. She couldn't have disappeared from view in such a short time. Brian began to shout louder, "Sarah! Sarah!" His voice echoed off the rocks. No answer. Panic started to set in. He ran back along the trail, checking every turn, every ledge. Maybe Sarah had slipped, fallen, hit her head, and was lying unconscious somewhere off the trail. Brian began searching the area around the trail. He climbed down a few feet down the slope, looked between the boulders, and checked every place where a person could lie. He shouted until he was hoarse. Nothing. Sarah was gone. Brian spent the next half hour searching desperately. He walked back and forth along the trail several times. He searched every possible place within a 330-foot radius. He checked the edge of the cliff. Maybe Sarah had gotten too close to the edge, lost her balance, and fallen. But the edge was far from the trail, and there were no traces, no footprints, broken branches, disturbed earth. Brian realized he had to go down and call for help. He quickly began to descend toward the ranger station. The descent took about an hour and a half. He practically ran, risking his own safety. By 3:30, he burst into the ranger station, gasping for breath, his eyes wide with panic. "My girlfriend is missing! She was on the trail 65 feet behind me. I turned away for a minute and she was gone. We have to go back and find her." The ranger immediately organized a preliminary search party. By 5 p.m., 6 rangers and volunteers had climbed to the spot Brian had indicated. They began searching the area. They shouted Sarah's name. They checked every section. The sun was setting. The light was fading. By 7 p.m., it was dark. The search was suspended until morning. It was dangerous to work on mountain trails at night. Brian spent the night at the ranger station, unable to sleep. Guilt and fear tormented him. Where was Sarah? What had happened to her? Why had he turned away? Why hadn't he checked to see if she was still there? At dawn, a full-scale search operation began. More than 300 volunteers, rangers from various parks, police, volunteers from local search and rescue services, and Sarah's friends and colleagues from Washington arrived at the park. The area was divided into sectors. Each sector was thoroughly combed. A helicopter flew over the area, looking for any signs: bright clothing, a backpack, a person. Climbers descended all accessible cliffs, checking crevices and ledges. Divers searched the streams and small pools in the valley below. Perhaps Sarah had somehow fallen and been carried away by the water. On the second day, 6 search dogs and their handlers were brought in. The dogs were given Sarah's clothes from her car in the parking lot to sniff. All 6 dogs picked up her scent from where Brian had last seen her. The trail led down the path, in the direction of the descent, for about 200 feet. Then the trail turned sharply to the left, away from the path, toward the edge of the cliff. The dogs led their handlers through the brush and rocks straight to the edge. At the very edge, all 6 dogs stopped. They began to whine, long, mournful whines. They refused to go any closer. Their handlers tried to direct the dogs further, but the animals categorically refused to go. One of the dog handlers explained, "The trail is clear. She was walking here toward the cliff. The trail ends at the edge. Either she jumped or she fell. But the dogs are afraid. They don't want to go near it. I've seen this behavior before, usually when they smell death." Rescue climbers descended the cliff. The height was about 150 feet, not a sheer wall, but a steep slope with ledges and boulders. If Sarah had fallen, she should have been lying somewhere below. The team methodically searched the entire slope. They checked every ledge, every crevice, every spot where a body could get stuck. Nothing was found. Nobody. No clothes, no backpack, no camera. Nothing. Down below, in the canyon at the foot of the cliff, another team searched the area. They checked between the boulders, under fallen trees, in overgrown areas. They walked along the stream, checking the water and the banks. 4 days of intensive searching yielded no results. The investigation team questioned Brian repeatedly. His story remained unchanged. He had his back to the trail for a minute at most, When he turned around, Sarah was gone. He didn't hear any screams, sounds of a fall, or anything unusual. Just silence. The lie detector showed that Brian was telling the truth. The psychological evaluation revealed no signs of deception or mental disorder. He genuinely did not understand what had happened to Sarah. His grief was real. The accident theory was the most likely. Experts speculated that Sarah had strayed from the trail to the edge of the cliff for some reason. Perhaps she saw something interesting and wanted to take a picture of the view. She got too close to the edge, the ground beneath her feet gave way, and she fell. But that didn't explain why her body hadn't been found. The cliff had been thoroughly searched. If she had lost, she should have been found. Another version was that Sarah had left voluntarily. Perhaps she was suffering from depression that no one knew about. Maybe she decided to end her life by jumping off the cliff, and her body was carried away somehow. But Sarah's loved ones rejected this version. She was a happy person, loved life, and had no problems that could lead to suicide. And again, where was the body? A criminal theory was also investigated. Perhaps someone was on the trail, attacked Sarah, and carried her body away. But all the other tourists who registered at the park that day were interviewed and checked. No one was in the area at the critical time. And how could someone have carried an adult woman off a mountain trail in 1 minute without being noticed by Brian, who was only 65 feet away? After 2 weeks, the official search operation was called off. Sarah's family organized a private search that lasted for months. They hired professional searchers, dogs, and even psychics. A $50,000 reward was offered. Nothing. Sarah Hollis was never found. The case remains open as an unexplained disappearance. Brian never recovered from that day. He quit his job and moved away from Washington. For years, he was haunted by nightmares. He would see Sarah walking behind him on the trail, then she would disappear. He would wake up in a cold sweat, screaming her name. In an interview several years later, Brian said, "I spent thousands of hours trying to figure out what happened. I turned away for less than a minute. The trail was open, visibility was good. It's physically impossible to get very far in such a short time. I checked every possible place. She just disappeared, as if she vanished into thin air." Paranormal theories also arose. Some spoke of time anomalies, portals, and abductions. Skeptics dismissed such ideas as fantasy, but for Sarah's family, the explanation doesn't matter. They just want to know what happened to her. They want to find her, give her a proper burial, and find peace. 32 years have passed since that October day. Sarah would now be 58 years old. She may have a family, children, and a career. Instead, she became another statistic, another name on a long list of people who disappeared into the American wilderness without a trace, without explanation, without answers. On 26th of June 1987, 44-year-old Michael Fitzpatrick, a history teacher from Portland, Oregon, arrived at Crater Lake National Park for a weekend with his wife, Dorothy. It was their annual ritual to spend a few days each summer in the park, admiring the deepest lake in the United States. Michael had been teaching American history in high school for 20 years and was a calm, methodical man who loved nature and photography. The couple stayed at Mazama Campground, at an elevation of about 6,000 feet. The weather was perfect. Late June, clear skies, and a temperature of around 70 degrees. On Saturday morning, they decided to drive along Rim Drive. This scenic road circles the lake at an elevation of 7,000 feet, offering breathtaking views of the crater and deep blue water. Around 11 a.m., the couple parked at Watchman Overlook, one of the most popular viewing points in the park. There were a few other tourists at the overlook, families with children, a couple of elderly people, a total of 8 people, not counting the Fitzpatricks. Michael got out of the car first. "I'm going to go take a look at the view and take a couple of pictures," he told his wife. Dorothy stayed in the car, taking the camera out of the bag on the back seat. Michael walked to the railing, about 30 feet from the parking lot. Dorothy later explained, "I was looking for the camera in the bag. There were a lot of things in there: snacks, water bottles, maps. It took me maybe 2 minutes to find it. No more. When I got out of the car with the camera, I expected to see Michael at the railing, but he wasn't there." She walked to the railing. Below her was a huge drop, about 1,000 feet to the surface of the lake. The deep blue water glistened below. "Michael!" she shouted. Only an echo bounced off the limestone cliffs. "Michael, where are you?" Dorothy began to look around. Maybe he had walked to the other side of the platform, to another viewing point. She walked around. Several tourists looked at her curiously. "Excuse me, have you seen my husband? He's tall, wearing a blue shirt, and was just here at the railing." One man replied, "I saw a man who came up to the fence a few minutes ago. I was distracted by the children for just a second. When I looked back, he was gone. I thought he had gone back to the car." Dorothy ran back to their car. Michael wasn't there. The car was empty. His belongings, a backpack, a bottle of water, a hat, were lying on the passenger seat. Panic began to set in. Where was he? She returned to the railing and looked down at the cliff. A terrible thought struck her. Could he have fallen? But the railing was sturdy, about 3 feet high. To fall over it, you would have to deliberately climb over it or take a bad step. Michael was a cautious person. He wouldn't take risks. Dorothy asked the other tourists at the overlook. No one had seen where the man in the blue shirt had gone. One said he had seen him at the railing, then got distracted. Another woman didn't remember a man in a blue shirt at all. Everyone was busy with their own things, taking pictures, looking at the lake. 20 minutes later, Dorothy drove to the nearest ranger station. By noon, 2 rangers had arrived at Watchman Overlook. They immediately began a search. They checked the entire observation deck and the trails leading from it. They descended a little way down the slope, checking to see if the man was lying unconscious somewhere below. By evening, 10 rangers were working at the site. They searched the area within a mile radius of the lookout. They checked all the trails, all the places a person could have gone on foot. They shouted Michael's name. Nothing. The next day, a full-scale search operation was organized. 4 search dogs with handlers were brought to the site. The dogs were given Michael's shirt from his belongings in the car to sniff. All 4 dogs approached the spot at the fence where Michael was last seen, and all 4 dogs refused to work. They sniffed the fence, looked down at the cliff, and began to whine. One German shepherd suddenly began to howl long and plaintively. The others backed away from the fence, tails tucked between their legs. All attempts by the handlers to direct the dogs along the trail were unsuccessful. One of the dog handlers explained, "They clearly sensed something at the fence, but they refused to continue. This behavior is usually when they smell death or something that frightens them." A team of climbers descended the cliff to the lake. They checked every ledge and crevice where a body could be stuck. They reached the water and searched the shore. Nothing was found. Divers searched the bottom of the lake in the area directly below Watchman Overlook. Crater Lake is 1,949 feet deep, the deepest in the United States. The water is cold and clear. Visibility is good to 100 feet. Divers checked the bottom within a 500-foot radius of the point directly below the overlook. There was no body. Helicopters flew over the park. More than 400 volunteers combed the woods around the lake. All trails within a 10-mile radius were checked. Every day, search teams searched new areas. 12 days of intensive searching yielded no results. The investigation team interviewed all the tourists who were at the observation deck that morning. Their stories were similar. No one saw where Michael went. One witness said he saw him at the fence, then looked away for just a second, and when he looked back, the man was gone. Dorothy was questioned repeatedly. Maybe Michael had reasons to disappear? Problems in his marriage? Financial difficulties? Depression? Dorothy categorically denied this. Their marriage was happy. They were financially stable. Michael loved his job, his students, and his life. He had no reason to disappear or harm himself. The accident theory seemed the most likely. Perhaps Michael had climbed over the railing to get a better photo, lost his footing, and fallen. But rescuers thoroughly searched the entire slope below the observation deck. There was no body. If he had fallen into the water, divers should have found the body at the bottom. There are no currents in the lake. It is a closed volcanic crater filled with rain and snow water. After 2 weeks, the official search operation was called off. The family organized a private search that lasted for months. Dorothy couldn't come to terms with the loss. Every weekend she went to the park, searching the same places over and over again. In the fall of 1989, 2 years and 3 months after Michael's disappearance, a group of hikers was walking along the lake shore on the opposite side of Watchman Overlook, about 8 miles away. It was a remote, difficult-to-access area where people rarely ventured. Among the boulders on the shore, they discovered human bones, a skull, several ribs and leg bones. The authorities were notified immediately. Forensic examination and DNA analysis took several weeks. The results confirmed that the remains were those of Michael Fitzpatrick. The pathologist was unable to determine the cause of death due to the condition of the remains. 2 years in the elements, rain, snow, animals, had left only bones. There were no signs of trauma that would indicate a violent death or a fall from a great height. The bones were just bones. The investigation team attempted to reconstruct the events. How did Michael's body end up on the opposite side of a vast lake, 8 miles from the place of his disappearance? Several theories were proposed. First, Michael somehow left the lookout on foot, walked around the lake, and died on the other side from natural causes or an accident. But that would have required walking about 16 miles across rough terrain. Why? And why didn't he tell his wife? And why did the search dogs lead to the cliff, not away from it? The second theory, Michael fell into the water from Watchman Overlook, drowned, and his body was carried by underwater currents to the opposite shore. But hydrologists who studied the lake found no significant currents. It is a closed crater. The water is relatively calm. Even if there had been a current, the body would not have traveled 8 miles along the bottom in 2 years and then somehow ended up on the shore. The third theory, someone killed Michael, moved the body to the opposite side of the lake, and left it there. But why? Michael had no enemies. There was no motive for murder. And how could the killer carry the body of an adult man 8 miles across mountainous terrain without being noticed? The mystery remained unsolved. How did the bones appear only 2 years later in a place that had been searched repeatedly during the initial search? Search teams checked the entire shore of the lake. If the body had been there from the beginning, they should have found it. Dorothy buried her husband's remains. The ceremony was quiet and modest. She never got answers to her questions. How did Michael disappear in 2 minutes from an open observation deck? How did his body end up 8 miles away? Why did the bones only appear 2 years later? The story of Michael Fitzpatrick has become one of the many mysteries of Crater Lake. Local rangers say the lake has a strange atmosphere. Some tourists report inexplicable sensations, dizziness, disorientation, at specific lookout points. Native Americans considered the lake a sacred and dangerous place where spirits dwell in the depths. 38 years have passed since that June day. Watchman Overlook remains a popular viewing platform. Thousands of tourists visit it every summer. Most are unaware of Michael Fitzpatrick's story, but those who know approach the railing with a special feeling, a mixture of awe and fear of the deep blue water below, which keeps its secrets as deep as the 949 feet of its bottom. That's all, friends. If you found this interesting, give it a thumbs up, write your opinion in the comments, and see you in new videos. Bye for now.